Hello. Thank you for joining me once again as I am reading The Children of the Law of One and the Lost Teachings of Atlantis by Jon Peniel. Very good book. Um, I hope that you are enjoying it as much as I am. I encourage everyone to pick this book up and read it for themselves, if not for anything, but for the meditation practices that are taught in this book and the energy techniques that are taught in this book from the Children of the Law of One. Okay, so today is chapter 2, and sit back, enjoy, and thank you once again for listening as I read the stories to you. Okay? Chapter 2, My Journey and Arrival. This book is an account of my personal journey and discovery, and most importantly, what it led me to, and can lead you to also. If you find some of the teachings or stories hard to believe, I understand perfectly. Some of my experiences were so incredible that even though I was personally experiencing them at that time, they were still almost hard for me to accept. But I had no choice but to ultimately accept them, whereas you do. However, those who really want the truth and are ready for it will recognize it. An intuition that unfettered by ego and selfishness will also sense truth and reality. In any case, the point and purpose of this book is not about my story, the alternative history, or the strange tales presented here. Frankly, they just don't matter. So read it all with a believe it or not approach. Keep it in mind that it is that it's absolutely fine with us if you don't believe any of the story or theory like aspects of the book. Regardless of whether or not the story is too incredible for your own sensibilities, this book is really about identifying the real disease behind our personal and world problems and the cure for it all: unselfish love. That's what we sincerely hope you get out of the book and find useful on your own credible personal journey through life. Other than that, we are not interested in convincing anyone of anything. Every individual needs to have his or her own realizations, foundations of understanding. In school, people are often required to take prerequisite classes before they can take certain other classes. That's because sometimes you need to understand certain fundamental concepts first before other classes will really make as much sense as possible or allow you to get the most out of it. The teachings presented in this book are similar. Some of them require prerequisites to understand. Thus, it was necessary to present the teachings in a specific understanding order. But because of this, the chronological order or time frame of my personal experiences at the monastery had to take a back seat in order, to the order in which the teachings are presented. For instance, in some earlier chapters, a discussion may be taking place when I was an elder monk, while in later chapters, a discussion that is taking place may have been from one of my first days at the monastery as a novice monk, and a rather egotistical novice. Some stories will even be after my time and training at the monastery was over and I was traveling the world. Many chapters include, but Many chapters include more than one discussion or experience I had from more than one time frame. If you pay close attention to the subtleties of conversations, you will understand basically what time frame it was taking place in. Taking the same mental approach to reading the book that you would with a chronological, jumbled mystery novel should make it more interesting and fun to read rather than confusing. My first steps as a My first steps, a strange child in a strange land. My final voyage began decades ago when I was 17 years old, but what led up to it began years prior. Like the Dalai Lama, I was destined to return to my previous position with our spiritual order. Unlike the Dalai Lama, I was not told of it in early childhood, nor was I aware of it. While I didn't have the kind of direct contact with elder monks like the Dalai Lama did, I had special caretakers on high, unbeknownst to me. Events outside my control were preparing me and compelling me to embark on a great adventure that would change my life beyond my wildest dreams. To simplify it, I guess you could say angels and saints were secretly guiding my young life. This book covers the period of my life at the monastery in more detail than what I offer about my childhood. That's because the monastic period is the most important as it is used to present the teachings. I only touch upon my childhood briefly in order to give you a sense of what I was like and what I experienced prior to returning to the monastery and rejoining brothers and sisters, my brothers and sisters. Some readers have commented about how they relate to my childhood experiences and have had similar experiences themselves. Thus, it helps them understand the entire process of spiritual change. I was a very strange and sensitive child, considered oversensitive, with unusual abilities. But when I was very young, I had no concept of being that way, what that meant, or why I was that way. It was just the norm for me. I had no idea that the reason for it was my I had no idea that the reason for my latent consciousness was my predestiny to return to the same state of being as when I left my previous life. Even so, many of the things I experienced were not just due to that. Many of you gentle and kind souls have experienced the same thing as I during your childhood. Abnormally bright, I was reading the newspaper at age 3 and self-learning to play music by 5. I couldn't relate to adults or other children for that matter, nor could I fathom why they were so mean, self-centered, and selfish. And their idea of fun. Many of the things they did seem either meaningless to me or worse, cruel. So my childhood was very painful and lonely. Sound familiar? As I approached my teenage years, I was further alienated when I was let down by my religion. It was a major religion which I will refrain from naming, but I would eventually have had the same crisis of faith with many other religions. As with most people, I was raised by my family to believe in their religion, and thus to believe in their concept of God. Just as when I was very young and time experiences pierced my illusion about the existence of Santa Claus, thus about the existence of Santa Claus, the same thing began happening with my belief in the existence of God. The dogma and behavior of the leaders and practitioners of my religion was shooting down my faith. Certain personal experiences and holes in teachings and practices ultimately let me down and left me feeling empty and even more alone. At first, only doubt about my faith set in, but finally, I was left with total disbelief. It was a horrible, dark time. The worst part was I didn't just lose faith in my religion, I lost faith in the existence of God. By the time I was 13, I had become an atheist. But it turned out that I had only lost faith in the concept of God that I had been taught. I didn't know it yet, but it was really the beginning of developing my own understanding of God, trying to connect pieces of an ancient puzzle. Looking out at the stars and observing the wonders of nature and life, I felt there must be something. There was order, constant new creation, symmetry, and beauty to it all, even if it were not what I had previously thought God was. There must be something to it or behind it that might be considered God. Or maybe it was all God. So before I was 14, I became an agnostic, one who doesn't believe in God, but doesn't necessarily believe in God, disbelieve in God either. Caught in a paradox, I knew there must be some force behind everything, but at the same time, I couldn't find any religion that really made total sense. And the tunnel vision theories of creation offered by most evolutionary scientists also left too far many unanswered questions and were full of holes. Nothing truly answered the questions about life that constantly tormented me nor eased my loneliness. It's not that I had a bad family life, it was better than most. Yet I still felt like an abandoned baby, left in a basket on the doorstep of a strange world. I had to find some kind of answers that made sense to me. I became obsessed. My thirst was insatiable. I had to find truthful answers that made sense about the origins and purpose of life. I read every book I could get my hands on about science, religion, philosophy, spirituality, and metaphysics. I tried different religions, including various Eastern philosophies. But at some point, I was always ultimately disappointed with with what I would find. I found bits and pieces of truth here and there, but something was always wrong with the entirety of the religion or the philosophy. Either something was missing in the teaching, or some aspect of the teaching didn't make sense, or the religion made the teachings more important than the purpose behind them, or it was too dogmatic. Yet I could not stop searching. I was always seeking to find a source for pure, constant truth and real answers to every one of my questions. At age 10, I had tested with a very high IQ, yet at age 16, I had flunked out of high school for various reasons. Around the same time, I had a terrible argument with my mother over religion and relationships. She didn't like my girlfriend or my rejection of the family religion. So I moved out of my parents' house, started college, got a job, and my own apartment. All of a sudden, I was thrust into having to face the facts of living in the real world. I didn't like what I saw and experienced. It was a dog eat dog world by and as far as I could see, there were only two kinds of dogs. Those who were eaten by other dogs and the dogs who did the eating. For all practical purposes, those were the only two basic ways of dealing with making a living and living your life. In other words, I realized that the world was basically populated by two kinds of people, the users and the used. The powerful and successful people of the world got that way and stayed that way by stepping on other people, whoever they needed to step on in order to get ahead. Thus, the majority of people were usually always getting stepped on. It hit me like a ton of bricks. We had a whole world based on this, and the results were starvation, suffering, and servitude for the most, while a few elite individuals had tremendous power and lived in incredible op- opulence and luxury. I also knew there were no good political solutions to the problems either, including such things as communism or socialism, because problems were in basic human nature. And corruption always seemed to get a big foothold, regardless of the political system. Even then, I realized the answer to this problem could only come from a change that took place inside every person on earth. And I knew the chances for that were absurd. As I matured, it became even more clear and even more unbearable. Eventually, my pain over this became overwhelming. I no longer wanted to live in a dog eat dog world. I couldn't tolerate the idea of living as one of the eaters or one of the eaten. I gradually began entertaining thoughts of suicide. New hope arises from an odd place. One day, someone recommended I read Robert Heinlein's book, Stranger in a Strange Land. Obviously, I could relate to the title alone, but there was far more to it. I couldn't put it down. Even though it was fiction, it stirred something deep inside me that was very real indeed. Something that haunted me from then on. An idea was planted in my mind that I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was no more than a mere concept, yet it was more. It presented a wonderful and great idea. It was the simple concept of human beings living together in a community in harmony as one big family who shared everything and unselfishly loved and cared for each other and all others. What a great idea, I thought to myself. That's it. That's the answer. That's what I was looking for. To me, I was represented in that science fiction book, seemed more like real spirituality or how truly spiritual people would live than most of the so called spiritual or religious books I'd read. I was sad that it was fiction and the people weren't real, but I didn't see why there couldn't really be people like that somewhere. It seemed to me, it seemed like If something could even be conceived of, it could also be real or eventually become real. So, fiction or not, it gave me hope and spurred me on to continue my spiritual search even harder. But after a while, it appeared that my search was futile. I simply wasn't able to find a religion, spiritual path, community, cult, or even one person that fit my ideal. My frustration over this eventually turned to deep despair. I grew increasingly despondent. And by age 17, I finally gave up on finding anything or anyone who really had all the pieces of this grand puzzle, or people who fully lived a life of truth, peace, harmony, and love. But right before I was about to do it, I had a very odd experience. One that not only resulted in my not killing myself, but in finding a new way of thinking and living. I was about to realize that there was a third way of living in this dog eat dog world. Not just like the two choices of being a dog eater or dog meat. The strange experience I was about to have would forever change things for me in ways I couldn't even imagine at the time. It must be the age of TV. What happened next was very bizarre. You might say it was a significant example of Jung's concept of synchronicity. But it was even more than that. For those who aren't familiar with the concept, synchronicity is like coincidence. But it is not just chance. It's actually meaningful, connected to other events, possibly even connected to the entirety of all things in the universe, God. But you could also call it universal flow or modern miracle. A simple example of this might be talking with someone about a certain topic, and then a song comes on the radio that fits the conversation perfectly and perhaps has a significant message regarding it. Just before I was about to take an overdose of sleeping pills to do myself in, I started I started old-fashioned channel surfing, turning the knob on my old black and white TV. I know it may sound strange to do that when you are in the process of killing yourself, and I didn't even know why I was doing it at the time. I thought maybe it was out of habit, maybe of out of desperation, maybe for entertainment, distraction, or comfort in my last minutes of life. But as it turned out, my channel surfing wasn't for any purpose, wasn't for any of those reasons. It was an urge I was following from some kind of divine guidance or protection that was compelling me to do it from within myself. Anyway, to my surprise, I turned the channel, changing knob. I noticed a picture on the U channel setting that was very strange indeed. There was never a station broadcasting on that channel before. In fact, at the time, there were no UHF stations at all. To make a long technical story short, for those of you too young to remember TV back then, there was a broadcast on a channel that virtually couldn't have been broadcast on it in those years. There was never anything but static on these channels previously, and it would be years into the future before any television shows would ever be broadcast on them. The odds against the entire complicated incident were beyond any odds. It could have only been some kind of higher force, a television test, or some television genius kid messing around with the airwaves. The latter possibilities quickly faded as I viewed the show. On my TV screen was a man who looked much like the stereotype image of God. It was sort of an interview, but a bit more like a lecture. As fate would have it, definitely the subject matter of the lecture was all about spirituality, God, the universe, creation, and a history that went way beyond any I'd even known. His energy and intensity was striking. His eyes seemed to look right through me, yet right at me, like he was actually speaking to me in person. It was as if Zeus, Merlin, and Moses had merged into one being and stepped out of history into my living room. He was dressed in a white robe. From from my studies, I recognized that he was wearing the type of ancient headdress worn by the Essenes and purportedly worn by a legendary ancient spiritual tradition called the Great White Brotherhood that I read about in books from the 1920s, not to be confused with modern groups that call themselves that. He spoke with perfect English, but with a subtle hint of an accent that was unidentifiable. And he pronounced certain words using British style pronunciation rather than American. As I listened to him speak, the man's every word struck a chord in me. They rang my inner bell of truth. Here was someone who obviously knew many of the scattered little bits of truth I'd found, but they were all consolidated into one teaching. As I listened in awe, his strange TV lecture answered my many unspoken questions. It was almost as if he were reading my mind. Even when he spoke of knowledge or concepts that I'd never heard before, I seemed to already know them somehow. Author's note: this book could have a similar effect on you, depending on who you are and what stage of your path you are in. Next, he spoke of his origins. No, it wasn't outer space or the heavens, while it was not nearly so far fetched as that, it was still amazing. He said he was a monk of an ancient spiritual order whose name in English was the Children of the Law of One, but that they were known by many names throughout the centuries. That name rang a bell, both internally and because I read something about it in the Edgar Cayce materials. As I listened, I was caught between feeling of total awe and wondering if this was really happening. Like maybe I was on candid camera or the butt of a practical joke. The man went on to say that their spiritual lineage, their teachings, and practices stretched back to ancient Egypt and before that, Atlantis. He said their order was not devoted to any one religion, dogma, or worshiping any leader, past or present, but rather it was dedicated to serving and experiencing God directly via the development and use of unselfish love. They were also dedicated to helping others achieve that if they wanted to and were ready for the task. While the true total freedom has never been a condition of life on earth, they taught how to develop real freedom of thought and consider free will choices to be a sacred right. But most importantly to me, they were devoted to living a life of giving, caring, kindness, compassion, and harmlessness. It was what I had been looking for my whole life. His description of their life invoked images that seemed like memories. It was like experiencing deja vu before even getting to the place or situation. You have the deja vu experience at all. I felt as if I had been there before. I was so excited, I literally almost passed out. I felt as if I had been there before. I had discovered that there were actually people out there who were living by all the same values and ideas I'd come to believe were true. And here I just actually totally given up on the possibility that other people who believed and felt as I did even existed in real life. Could it be I had finally found what I was searching for my whole life, just as I was permanently giving up? As my mind raced with excitement and question, the man gave directions and instructions for getting to one of their monasteries. In Tibet, no less. Then the screen went back to static. And there was never another show on that channel. I later found out this was not a broadcast for the public, which will be explained in another chapter. I didn't understand how this could have happened, but nevertheless, it changed the direction of my life. I intuitively, at least, knew this much. It wasn't a joke, hoax, or a hallucination. My course was set. While I was still only 17 years old, I was determined to change my life no matter what it took or where I had to go. In fact, I was compelled to do so as a moth is drawn to a light. Author's note. Many of my experiences, such as those above and those you will soon read, are very unusual. This is because even though I didn't know it at the time, I was a high-ranking teacher, priest, or initiate monk of our monasteric order. It was who and what I was in my previous life. It just hadn't come to fruition in this life yet. I was unaware of it at the time because I was in a sort of embryonic stage. Now I was being called home to fulfill my destiny. This is similar to how Tibetan Buddhists seek out the new reincarnations of their head monks, yet obviously different in this case. Since the first printing of this book, people have contacted us wanting to enter one of our monasteries. But our monasteries have always been private, designated for those already of the order who have reincarnated. Although a few newcomers are accepted by head monks, the occasions are rare, and new monks are only accepted after long periods of demonstrating readiness. However, people wanting spiritual growth and fellowship also have another alternative to the traditional monastery. They can now start or join various local Golden Rule programs with the help of the new Golden Rule Organization, GRO. These programs provide some of the benefits of a monastery without the need for moving, changing jobs, or having a teacher. Information on GRO and the Golden Rule Workbook are at the end of the book. A few people have been irrationally obsessed with details about Atlantis, my journey, my personal life, or the location of our monasteries. Most people are understandably curious, but not obsessed. However, because of the nature and purpose of this book, there's really no reason to elaborate on those topics, while there are reasons not to. The sole purpose of this book is to present detailed spiritual teachings and demonstrate making spiritual changes using my experiences as an example. While we tried to make it very interesting, this isn't a novel or storybook. And it's a waste of effort, time, and money to fill it with stories that don't teach a spiritual lesson of some kind. It is also not the book's purpose to be a biography of my or my family's personal private life, nor to present evidence of ancient historical or archaeological discoveries. There are many interesting books that focus on ancient history, lost civilization, free power systems, etc. But this really isn't the book for you if that's what you are primarily interested in. This book was written only for those who are primarily interested in spiritual truths and spiritual growth, not for those interested in irrelevant details in empty, useless knowledge. Thus, the only parts of my story it contains are those that others might spiritually benefit from reading about. Also, please keep in mind that this book isn't about the story, it's about the teachings. So, it also doesn't matter to us if you don't believe any of the story you are about to read. But you can only benefit from all that life offers you if you keep an open mind and judge everything independently. We believe that everyone should question the validity of all teachings or beliefs, but only in value of teachings or philosophy. Wait a minute. We believe that everyone should question the validity of all teachings or beliefs, but only in light of whether the effects of them are good or bad. The wise examine the value of any teaching or philosophy independently, judging it by the outcome of, of living by it. Everything in life should be contemplated and examined regarding its benefit, lack of benefit, or potential harm. An alcoholic may tell you it's bad to drink. A fool may speak a wisdom. A liar may be speaking the truth. A 3-year-old child may speak the most precious wisdom ever known to humankind for the first time in history. Should they be disregarded? So please consider the teachings separately from the story. Read them with an open mind, then ask yourself, do they stand the test of rationality, of goodness? What would happen if I lived by these teachings? What would happen if everyone in the world lived by them? What does my intuition tell me? After that, then you may judge. Privacy and the please do not disturb sign. As mentioned earlier in this book, is not about the monastery either. The monastery is but a place, and within the context of this book, it is used as a backdrop for the story and discussions that present the spiritual teachings. Those of our order wish to remain undisturbed and anonymous, as I do. Our order is not alone in this. Regardless of religion, those who decide to become a cloistered nun or monk do so to devote themselves to a spiritual life and choose the monastic path because they want solitude and to be in an isolated environment away from the outside world, so they can live and practice their religion unmolested and without distraction. That is part of what every monastery convent is for and provides. Thus, no monastery would want the kind of attention a book like this would bring to it. Even more so in our case. As mentioned earlier in the book, we have legitimate reasons for maintaining the secrecy we have cherished for thousands of years. But later, you will read about some new reasons that further substantiates that need. Also, those of us who travel and work in the outside world also need our privacy and anonymity in order to do our work and live in relative peace. In summary, since our order wishes to live quietly, in solitude, undisturbed, and unmolested, this book has been deliberately written to avoid any references that may jeopardize our solitude and privacy, including the location of monasteries. The fool takes his first step. As wild as this may sound to some people, there really are forces of what you might call light and darkness, or good and evil, that work behind the scenes of this limited physical world we seem to live in. I didn't understand it at the time, other than having an intellectual grasp of the concept, which was far from being in touch with the realities of what that meant. Unbeknownst to me, they knew my every move. While I was being guided and somewhat protected by the forces of light, The other side was trying to throw me off track or destroy me. The outcome would ultimately depend on the choices I would make. My first test and struggle was to be with the major resistance I encountered from my family and friends. They didn't like the idea. They didn't like the whole idea. They didn't want me to leave. And they didn't like the idea of me joining others of like-minded. Generally, people would rather keep you with them in the hole they're in rather than let you go off and offer a helping hand to help them out of the hole. So, those of us who want to get out of the holes ourselves often not only don't get support, we get just the opposite. We get people and sometimes events doing everything they can to prevent it and keep us in the hole. Even though I hadn't lived at home since I was 16, my mother initially attempted to keep me from going by using her parental authority, refusing to let me go and threaten me with the police or putting me in an institution because I was underage. Then, when she realized that wouldn't work, she pulled me one of the oldest mother tricks in the book, the famous "I'm sick. You can't leave me now" routine. Most people are capable of making themselves sick, psychosomatically or accidentally, but she was beyond that. She had been studying hypnosis, the power of the mind and such, for as long as I could remember. So she made herself sick. And while it was nothing serious at all, it was a somewhat painful temporary illness, an outbreak of sores that was more painful if she didn't stay in bed. So she was using that along with saying I was being selfish for leaving as a guilt trip in an attempt to manipulate my life and free will choices. But she had already kicked me out of the house a year prior because of her jealousy towards my girlfriend. So I wasn't living with her anyway. And there were dozens of other relatives looking after her. But even if it were more serious, I would still had to leave. I found out why later. I was internally compelled to go regardless of any obstacles, let alone ones she was deliberately creating to manipulate me and keep me there. My internal drive and feelings were so strong, I felt like I would die if I didn't change my life, which was probably true. There was truly no choice. For those of you who might feel sorry for my mother, ask yourself if she was serving the light or just herself, and subsequently the dark. Then there were my so-called friends, who turned out to be fair weather friends, as most turn out to be one day when the chips are down. Most of them never liked my spiritual pursuits, and my new goal was the worst, as far as they were concerned. All but one tried to talk me out of it. They told me I was crazy to go, crazy to give up everything. And like my mother, they tried to make me feel guilty about abandoning them. They didn't want to get out of the hole they were in, and I did. and they wanted me to stay in mine. I didn't know at the time, but my old friends, without knowing it, were also being unconscious pawns of the dark side. But considering my momentum and strong desire, they could not even from my goal either. They could not avert me from my goal either. The urge to go felt almost biological, like a salmon needing to swim upstream to return to its spawning grounds. My friend John was the only person I knew who didn't try to talk me out of going. While he wasn't really supportive, he wasn't resistive either. He said, "You got to do what you got to do." We actually had a lot in common at the time. He and I were always able to have spiritual conversations and agreed on many things unless they threatened his life choices. As we said our goodbyes and talked about life, he felt more and more like joining me. All of a sudden, he decided to go for it. But when he called his girlfriend and told her about his decision, she gave him some news that stopped him dead in his tracks. She said she was pregnant. And it wasn't the usual accidental story. She admitted she had deliberately stopped using birth control, which John assumed she was still using. Because she loved him so much and wanted to have his baby. Whether it was true at the time or not, she deliberately got pregnant in a scheme to entrap him. She knew he was the kind of guy who would do the honorable thing and marry her. And he did. But what is the honorable thing? When you have deliberately entrapped so dishonorably, it's one thing to take responsibility for an unexpected but legitimate event, but quite another to play victim to such a treacherous scheme. A family that starts with that kind of severe and serious deception can only end badly, which it did. The dark side at work again, only against him this time. I advised him against it, but he insisted on doing the right thing anyway. I saw John again many years later. He and his wife had an ugly divorce after having 2 children. He was miserable and had become an alcoholic with numerous DUIs. John had irrevocably missed a significant fork in his path that I now know would have changed his life and those of others for the good. For me, it was back to the road, alone and with new sadness. Author's note: everyone who starts on a true spiritual path encounters multiple obstacles and attempts to derail them. It just happens in different ways for each individual. Keep this in mind if you are taking your first step. It can happen in so many ways. A great new job offer, an old lover you'd never gotten over finally calls and says they want to get back together. Your car breaks down. You name it. It can happen. People may also twist things. You may be told you are being selfish by making your spiritual pursuits a priority when the fact is you are actually starting a path towards becoming unselfish for the first time in your life. Anything that can possibly deter you from what you really want to do, and the goals you've set for yourself may come up. I'm going to take a break right now and be right back with you.